At a bustling train station, a police officer threw a black woman's belongings onto the floor, unaware that she was a federal judge. It was a moment of humiliation that turned into a challenge to the system. What followed would shock even those who had seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Olivia Warren, a prominent federal judge, stood calmly at the train station, waiting for her driver. Her modest suitcase was neatly placed beside her. The station buzzed with activity, but Olivia remained focused, checking her meeting schedule on her phone. Suddenly, a young police officer in uniform appeared in front of her. His face carried a mix of tension and curiosity. This was Officer Mark Hale, recently transferred to the city. Scanning the crowd, he seemed intent on identifying someone who might arouse suspicion. His gaze locked onto Olivia. "Show me your ID and open your suitcase for inspection," he demanded curtly, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Excuse me, but on what grounds?" Olivia asked calmly. "We're inspecting luggage for prohibited substances," Mark replied, grabbing her suitcase before she could protest. Without hesitation, he opened it, and, to the shock of onlookers, dumped its contents onto the dirty floor. Documents, books, and personal belongings scattered for all to see. Passers-by began to stop, watching the scene with a mix of astonishment and disapproval. "This is an abuse of power," Olivia said firmly, her voice steady, though her eyes reflected unshakable resolve. Mark ignored her, rifling through her belongings and making loud remarks. "Something's not right here," he sneered, clearly relishing the moment. A small crowd started to gather, murmuring in discontent. Some had already begun recording the incident on their phones. One man in the crowd spoke up. "Hey, officer, this is going too far." "Stay out of it, or I'll detain you too," Mark snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. Meanwhile, Olivia, composed as ever, reached for her phone and made a call. The crowd grew silent, watching her confident actions. At that moment, Mark's partner, Officer Linda Carter, approached. Her face turned pale as recognition dawned. "Mark, do you realize what you're doing? She's a federal judge," Linda whispered urgently, trying to stop him. "Don't be ridiculous. She's just another liar." Mark dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "We'll see who she really is soon enough." But this day wouldn't go the way Mark expected. Olivia, calm and collected, quietly spoke into her phone. "I need assistance. Train station. Immediately, within minutes, everything changed. A few minutes later, a sleek black car with tinted windows pulled up outside the station. Two men in sharp suits stepped out, their presence immediately drawing whispers from the crowd. The tension thickened as one of the men walked confidently toward Olivia. "Judge Warren, are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning the scattered belongings on the floor. Mark, seeing this, began to grow visibly nervous, but summoning his resolve, he stepped forward. "And who are you?" he demanded. "This is my investigation. She could have been carrying prohibited substances." "Prohibited substances?" the man repeated coldly. "Officer, you've just flagrantly violated the Fourth Amendment. Allow me to remind you that you're dealing with a federal judge." Mark's face turned pale. Behind him, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, and phones continued to capture every moment. His partner, Linda Carter, tried to intervene. "Mark, we need to stop. This has gone way too far," she said, her voice pleading. But Mark, still unwilling to admit fault, raised his voice. "We have the right to inspect luggage. She refused to comply, so I acted within the law." The men from the car, now identified as federal marshals, exchanged a glance. One of them turned to Linda. "Take him away. He's only making this worse," he instructed firmly. Linda, recognizing the gravity of the situation, sighed heavily and approached Mark. "Let's go, Mark. This is over." But Mark stood rooted to the spot. The phrase federal judge echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. His eyes locked onto Olivia, who was calmly gathering her belongings without a single word directed at him, as if he didn't exist. That silence struck him harder than any reprimand could. I didn't know," he muttered, his gaze dropping to the floor. Olivia, now holding the last of her items, rose slowly, Her voice was firm and steady. Didn't know? And what if it hadn't been a federal judge? Is this how you always treat those who don't look the way you expect them to? The crowd erupted in applause. Someone shouted, "Well said!" The words, captured on countless phones, echoed across the station. Olivia turned to the marshals. "I'm ready to leave. There's nothing more to discuss here." Mark remained standing in the middle of the station, surrounded by eyes filled with disdain and cameras capturing every flicker of his expression. He was trapped in the spotlight, the weight of his actions settling in as the federal judge walked away. The next day, the train station incident became a nationwide sensation. Videos captured by onlookers flooded social media, amassing millions of views. The footage showed Officer Hale dumping Olivia Warren's belongings onto the floor and dismissing her protest with blatant disregard. Outraged comments poured in, and the hashtag #HackJudgeWarren topped trending lists. The local police department quickly found itself at the center of the scandal. The police chief, after watching the viral footage, summoned Hale and his partner Linda Carter to his office. Linda appeared anxious, while Hale looked flustered and defensive. "Do you realize what you've done?" the chief began, slamming a tablet with the video onto the desk. "You've brought shame to this department on a national scale. This wasn't just a mistake. You broke the law, Hale." Mark tried to defend himself. "Chief, I thought she was—" "Thought?" the chief interrupted, slamming his hand on the desk. "You didn't check her ID. You didn't request proper authorization for a search. You turned this into a public spectacle with dozens of witnesses. And worst of all, you humiliated a federal judge." Linda stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen." The chief let out a heavy sigh. "Linda, you might be able to get out of this with minimal consequences. But you, Hale." He turned to Mark with a piercing glare. "You're placed on administrative leave while this incident is investigated, and you'd better prepare yourself for a disciplinary hearing." Meanwhile, Olivia returned to her judicial duties, though her phone rang incessantly with calls from journalists, activists, and colleagues. Messages of support poured in from the legal community, political leaders, and everyday citizens, shocked by the injustice she had faced. Her colleague, Judge Garrett, called her directly. "Olivia, I saw the video. This is unacceptable. Are you planning to sue the department?" "Not yet," Olivia replied. "But I plan to use this moment to spotlight broader issues. This isn't just about me. It's about how often people are demeaned because of the color of their skin." The video continued to gain traction. News outlets interviewed eyewitnesses who recounted the events in vivid detail. Mark Hale became a symbol of police bias, while Olivia Warren emerged as a hero for standing her ground. Tensions grew within the police department. Some officers condemned Hale for tarnishing their reputation, while others quietly defended him, claiming he was just doing his job. But Mark knew this wasn't just about him. He had become a face of a system now under scrutiny. That evening, Mark sat alone in his apartment, watching the news. Reports focused on police reform and systemic racism, with his actions at the center of the discussion. As the broadcast continued, Mark began to grapple with the weight of what had happened. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a larger problem, and for the first time, he realized he had played an active role in perpetuating it. Several weeks later, the hearing before the city commission drew a packed audience. Officer Hale's case had become a national talking point, emblematic of systemic discrimination in law enforcement. Olivia Warren was the key witness. Composed and confident, Olivia stepped up to the microphone. "This case isn't about me," she began. "It's about those who face this kind of treatment every day. I stand here not just as a federal judge, but as a representative of those who are humiliated and stripped of their rights without cause. The system that allows this to happen must change." Her words were met with applause. Journalists in the front row captured every gesture and statement. Across from her, Mark Hale sat with his head bowed, his face pale. He knew this was the moment of truth. Meanwhile, reforms had begun within the police department. Under public pressure, the police chief announced mandatory ethics training for all officers. New protocols were introduced, requiring justified and documented reasons for searches and detentions. But for Mark Hale, it was the end of his career. The commission ruled that his actions had violated the law and ordered his dismissal. Walking through the department corridors for the last time, he passed former colleagues who avoided his gaze. Linda Carter, his former partner, gave him a brief parting remark. "I hope you've learned something. I tried to warn you." The story didn't end there. Olivia used the spotlight on her case to launch a campaign for transparency and fairness in law enforcement. She gave interviews, spoke at conferences, and raised awareness about racial bias. After one of her speeches, a young man approached her. "Judge Warren, thank you for what you're doing. I was once detained for no reason, and I thought nothing could change. Now I see that it can." Olivia smiled, though her expression remained serious. Change is possible, but it takes time. We all have to be part of the process. As for Mark Hale, he retreated from public life. His face became synonymous with incompetence and bias, and he spent months reflecting on his actions. A year later, he sent a letter to Olivia. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to say that I've come to understand my mistake. Your words changed the way I see many things. I hope you continue your work." Olivia read the letter and placed it in her drawer. She knew one letter wouldn't change the system, but perhaps it was a first step towards something greater. The story ended, but its echoes continued to reverberate across the nation, inspiring others to fight for justice and equality.